A black family's move to their dream home spirals into chaos when a neighbor calls the police, claiming they don't belong. The viral fallout exposes deep-seated racism, ignites public outrage, and forces a fight for justice that shocks everyone involved. But let's start at the beginning. Linda and Robert Taylor stood beside their bright yellow moving truck, their faces glowing with excitement as they began unloading boxes into their new home. The sound of their 3-year-old son, Noah, giggling as he chased a colorful beach ball across the front yard, added a cheerful rhythm to the otherwise quiet suburban street. This was a moment they had dreamed of, owning a home in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets, wide sidewalks, and a playground just a block away. For the Taylors, it was a milestone symbolizing safety, stability, and success. Inside nearby houses, shadows moved behind curtains and blinds as neighbors peeked out, observing the scene. Despite the buzz of activity on the Taylors' lawn, the street remained silent. No one came to welcome them or even acknowledge their arrival. Across the road, Douglas Winters, a 55-year-old white man with salt and pepper hair and a perpetually stern expression, stood at his living room window, watching intently. His lawn, perfectly manicured with not a blade of grass out of place, mirrored his rigid sense of order. Douglas tightened his arms across his chest, his posture stiff with disapproval. He had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, considering himself its unofficial gatekeeper. To him, the Taylors' presence was a disruption to the harmony he thought he was protecting. As he watched Linda laugh and lift Noah onto her hip while unloading a box, a bitter thought crept into his mind. "They don't belong here," he muttered to himself. As the sun set, casting a warm orange glow over the street, the Taylors remained busy, carefully arranging their belongings inside their new home. The only sounds were the scrape of furniture being moved and Noah's occasional bursts of laughter. Across the street, Douglas paced his living room, his unease festering into resentment. With each box unloaded, his frustration grew. Finally, he picked up the phone, his voice steady and firm as he spoke. "I'd like to report trespassers," he told the dispatcher. "They're acting suspiciously, moving things into the house across the street." Douglas hung up, satisfied he was doing his duty to protect the neighborhood, completely oblivious to the harm his actions would cause. The next morning, Linda stepped onto her new front porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and the quiet hum of birdsong filled the street. She took a deep breath, letting the calm of her new surroundings wash over her. This was the life she had envisioned, a safe, peaceful neighborhood where her family could thrive. Her tranquility was shattered by the screech of tires and the blaring of sirens. Startled, she looked up to see 2 police cars pulling into her driveway, their red and blue lights piercing the calm morning. Officers emerged, their hands hovering near their belts, their expressions stern and cautious. Linda's heart raced. She stepped forward, carefully setting her mug down on the railing. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "We received a report about suspicious activity at this address," one officer said curtly, his gaze sweeping over the porch and front yard. "Can we see some identification?" Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Robert appeared in the doorway, holding a sleepy-eyed Noah in his arms. "Suspicious activity?" Robert repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "This is our home." He handed Noah to Linda and retrieved their IDs and the paperwork from the home purchase, thrusting them toward the officers. His movements were deliberate, but restrained, his frustration barely concealed. Across the street, Douglas stood on his lawn, arms crossed, a smug grin creeping across his face. "See? Told you they didn't belong here, he muttered under his breath, watching the scene unfold as though it were a victory. The officers examined the documents, their stern expressions softening as realization dawned. One officer handed the papers back with a hesitant smile. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding. You're all set," he said awkwardly. As the police left, Linda turned to face Douglas, her voice trembling with both anger and disbelief. "Was it you?" she called. "Did you call the police on us?" Douglas strode forward, his face flushed with defiance. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "People like you don't just show up in neighborhoods like this." Robert stepped closer, his voice calm but unyielding. "We bought this house fair and square. We're your neighbors now, whether you like it or not." The weight of his words hung in the air, a promise and a challenge. That evening, Linda sat on the couch with her laptop, still shaken from the morning's events. She opened a blank post on social media and began typing, her fingers moving quickly as emotions poured out. "We moved into our dream home, only to have the police called on us by a neighbor who assumed we didn't belong. This is what systemic racism looks like." She attached a picture of her family standing on their porch, smiling despite the pain in their eyes, and hit post. Within hours, her story spread like wildfire. Comments and shares flooded in from across the country. Strangers expressed outrage, offering words of support and condemning the racism the Taylors had endured. Some even offered legal advice or community resources. Among the reactions were some internet sleuths who pieced together Douglas's identity from the background of Linda's photos. Soon, his name and address were circulating online, turning him into the face of suburban prejudice. The next morning, Douglas awoke to a storm. His phone buzzed incessantly with text messages, emails, and social media notifications. The subject lines of emails were harsh. "Shame on you," "Racist coward," and "This is who you really are." His social media accounts were flooded with comments, many demanding an explanation, others outright hostile. By mid-morning, news outlets had picked up the story, further amplifying the backlash. Douglas's employer was not far behind. By the time lunch rolled around, he received a cold call from HR. "Douglas, we've been made aware of your actions. We need to talk," his boss said curtly. The conversation was tense, his employer making it clear that the company could not afford the negative attention. Meanwhile, Linda and Robert's experience was the polar opposite. Their porch became a symbol of support and solidarity as baskets of baked goods, flowers, and handwritten notes began to arrive. Some were from neighbors who admitted they hadn't acted sooner to make the Taylors feel welcome. A few apologized for not standing up to Douglas's behavior before it escalated. Though the gestures touched the Taylors, they remained cautious. The sudden surge of goodwill felt fragile, almost performative. "Let's see if this lasts," Robert said quietly as they unpacked another basket of gifts. Linda nodded, knowing their place in the neighborhood would ultimately depend on actions, not apologies. Days later, a community meeting was called at the local park. Linda and Robert attended reluctantly, unsure of what to expect. To their surprise, most of the neighborhood had turned out, including Douglas, who sat in the back, avoiding eye contact. One of the neighbors, an older woman named Margaret, spoke first. "What happened to the Taylors was wrong," she said firmly. "This isn't the kind of neighborhood I want to live in." Other neighbors began to share their thoughts, some admitting their own biases, others expressing regret for not standing up sooner. Finally, Douglas rose, his face pale but resolute. "I owe the Taylors an apology," he began. "What I did was wrong. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I made an assumption I had no right to make. Linda and Robert listened silently as Douglas apologized. While the sincerity of his words was unclear, they recognized the weight of the moment. "We hope this is the start of a change in this community," Robert said. But actions speak louder than words. In the months that followed, the Taylors slowly became part of the neighborhood. Linda joined the community garden, and Robert helped organize a block party. Douglas remained distant, but started making small gestures, like waving when he saw them, or dropping off mail mistakenly delivered to his house. The experience left an indelible mark on everyone involved, a reminder of the work still needed to dismantle prejudice and create truly inclusive communities. For the Taylors, their new house was no longer just a dream. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one they were determined to write on their own terms.